A gentle hush fell over the tea and comfort shop as the clock above the counter chimed 3 times. Outside, a mild afternoon sun gilded the signboard, emphasizing the large floral script that promised cozy conversation and fresh scones. Inside, it was all polished linoleum and petite tables ringed with wicker-back chairs, punctuated by the faint sound of a hiss from the kettle. Overhead, an electric light hummed quietly. Technological progress nestled among doilies and flowered cushions. Miss Marple sat at her usual spot by the window, posture straight, spoon tapping once against the rim of her porcelain teacup. She wore a neat grey ensemble with discreet pearl buttons, every thread arranged just so. At first glance she might have been any well-mannered spinster, a fixture in village life, yet there was a particular set to her kindly blue eyes, sharp, at odds with the softness of her smile. Folks around here had learned that Miss Marple's innocent demeanour often disguised an uncanny knack for perceiving the smallest incongruities. At the next table, old Mr. Pickering, a local with a generous moustache that obscured half his face, mulled over the day's gossip. His voice, low yet urgent, spilled over to Miss Marple's keen ears. "Wisterfield Hall's rearing its head again," he muttered, pausing to take a bite of fruit-cake. "Heard a solicitor's sniffing around. Something about an unsolved murder. Can you imagine that after all these years?" A hush followed, brief but telling. Across from Pickering, Mrs. Watkins, she who had an insatiable appetite for rumour, leaned forward. "They say it's the family curse. Goes back generations, you know. Hardly a year passes that we don't hear about another tragedy brewing at that place." She gave a theatrical shudder, the jewelled brooch at her throat catching a glint of sunlight. There it was again, the Wisterfield curse. The name flickered across Miss Marple's memory like a half-forgotten photograph in a dusty album. She recalled hearing snatches of that story in her youth, hushed whispers about a grand old family whose misfortunes were so regular they simply blamed a curse. It struck her as something no more real than the boogeyman lurking under a bed. Until, of course, bodies turned up. She sipped her tea with deliberate slowness. In the tinted reflection on the tea-shop's large window, she watched Mr. Pickering and Mrs. Watkins confer in conspiratorial tones. Occasionally they darted a glance her way, as if wanting her to overhear, but not daring to speak directly. Eventually, Mrs. Watkins's voice rose just enough for Miss Marple to catch the salient titbit. "Mr. Pendleton, old solicitor from Morchester. He's asked around for discreet help. I hear he wants a real observational type. Some say Miss Marple might fit the bill." She gave a dramatic pout. "But hush now. Best not to start talking out of turn." Miss Marple felt the faint quirk of a smile at the corner of her mouth. Discreet help was an interesting choice of words. Hardly a day went by in St. Mary Mead that someone didn't need assistance unravelling one little puzzle or another. But a solicitor sniffing around a family curse, well, that was a horse of a different colour. She reached for her saucer to cloak her expression as she pieced this together. Behind the counter, Mrs. Summers, proprietress of the tea-room, clinked teacups while casting curious glances at her clientele. Miss Marple merely gave a polite nod to the woman and returned to her internal narrative. She had heard of something nasty at Wisterfield Hall once before. Her old friend Dolly Bantry had recounted a half-whispered story about unexplained footsteps in locked corridors and a distant relative found dead under strange circumstances. The details were fuzzy now, but the hallmark was that word, curse. Her mind cast back to the immediate present. She took in the floral wallpaper, the hum of gentle conversation, the buttery aroma of fresh pastries. The cosy domestic scene always lulled one into a sense of safety, but Miss Marple understood that even the homeliest village was capable of harbouring deep secrets. Dashiell Hammett might have chased his cynics and crooks through the neon-lit streets of a big city, but here a lethal drama could just as well brew behind lace curtains and crocheted seat cushions. At a neighbouring table, a frizzy-haired woman half-whispered, "Of course, if Mr. Pendleton's investigating, it must be serious. That family's tragedies, They never did make sense. The remark rattled around Miss Marple's orderly mind, linking itself to the older recollections. She set her cup down with a barely perceptible clink. If a solicitor was hunting for help, perhaps the Wisterfield business wasn't just about some dusty rumour. It might be a matter of real consequence. And if that was so, Miss Marple had always believed one thing: truth seldom remained hidden where inquisitive eyes persisted. Outside, an automobile sputtered by, jarring the hush within the tea shop. The villagers' talk turned to more everyday concerns. Upkeep of gardens, whether the vicar's sermon ran too long, that sort of trifling. But Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. Her keen glance took stock of every subtle reaction. She noted the hush that fell whenever the Wisterfield name crossed someone's lips. Nerves, anticipation, possibly even fear. She dabbed her mouth with a napkin, then regarded the tea shop once more. This was her routine, after all, tea and a slice of village chatter. It wasn't a lively, big-city nightlife, but from a certain angle it was far more revealing. People let details slip in a place like this, lulled by the presence of cream cake and the everyday. Rising gracefully, Miss Marple adjusted her gloves and smoothed the front of her skirt, quiet satisfaction nudging the corners of her smile. A solicitor seeking her assistance in a long-buried family scandal? That sounded like a perfect end to an otherwise ordinary Wednesday afternoon. And if the Wisterfield curse was resurrecting its old theatrics, well, that was quite the clue to chase down. She paid her bill and stepped out onto the cobblestone lane, a mild breeze rustling her neat white hair. The quiet of St. Mary Mead enveloped her, but she carried the faint echo of rumour with her, a secret thread soon to be pulled. Across the street, two villagers watched her go. They might have wondered what mild Miss Marple found so interesting in all this talk of curses and murder, but Miss Marple herself had no question about it. Nothing stirred her curiosity like hearing that someone, somewhere, had a puzzle that needed solving. The express carriage from St. Mary Mead rattled into Morchester just past 10 in the morning. A watery sun cast half-hearted light on the bustling thoroughfare where motor cars mingled with horse-drawn cabs. An era in flux. Miss Marple stepped onto the pavement with measured composure, taking in the swirl of city life before turning down a quieter lane, its cobblestones damp from a recent drizzle. At the end of that lane stood an Edwardian row building with a polished brass plate that read Pendleton and Sons, Solicitors. She entered the reception area to find it hush, lit only by a single window left ajar for fresh air. A grandfather clock ticked in the corner, underscoring the place's sense of orderly gravity. An efficient-looking clerk peered up from his ledger and rose, greeting her with courtesy. "This way, Miss Marple," he said, leading her down a short hallway. "Mr. Pendleton is expecting you." Inside the solicitor's office, the scent of well-oiled leather and old paper greeted her. Mahogany shelves lined the walls, tightly packed with volumes of law reports, all carefully labelled in neat gold lettering. Mr. Pendleton himself was of medium height and unassuming build, grey at the temples, neatly combed hair, and an air of mild agitation beneath his polished civility. He offered Miss Marple a seat by his desk, where a green-shaded lamp accentuated the lingering shadows in the corners of the room. The single window behind him allowed a modest shaft of morning light to cut across a scattering of documents. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple," he began, voice at a conspiratorial hush. "Do apologize for any imposition." Miss Marple's eyes traced the precise angles of his workspace, each paper stacked meticulously, no stray pen or ink blot in sight. A place of order, she thought, that seldom played host to talk of supernatural curses. "Not at all, Mr. Pendleton," she replied gently. "I understand you have certain concerns regarding Wisterfield Hall." Her mention of the estate's name brought a slight contraction of his shoulders. He folded his hands atop the desk. "I imagine you've heard the rumours. That house and that family." He paused, glancing at the door as though it might have ears of its own. "Let's call it a history of Untimely misfortune, Miss Marple nodded with polite neutrality. Some whisper it's a curse. He let out a breath that might have been a half-laugh if it wasn't so serious. Yes, the cursed Wisterfields, with their superstitions and their secrets. I've personally never given credence to ghosts or hexes, but the talk has persisted for decades. And a particularly tragic event, well, it remains unresolved. In the year 1922 to be specific, a muscle twitched in his jaw as he opened a leather-bound folder on his desk. Inside were yellowed pages, the corners curled and worn. But now this. He slid a fragment of paper toward Miss Marple, an old diary entry, the ink faint but still legible enough to mention fearful crimes. She held the delicate sheet between her gloved fingers. Scraps of a personal account, scrawled in a firm, feminine hand. Too many accidents to be chance? We must keep the truth hidden, or so I am told. The words carried a quiet chill. You believe these diaries suggest something more deliberate than misfortune? He looked at her squarely. I do, and so does one member of the family. Though he won't speak of it openly, he's asked me to make discreet inquiries. In times past, the local authorities accepted the notion of a family curse and left it at that. But those diaries hint at something altogether darker, something that's been systematically covered up. She returned the diary scrap to its folder. I see, and you want me to discover what truly happened? Mr. Pendleton straightened his vest as though the gesture might shore up his resolve. Precisely. You've a reputation, Miss Marple, for noticing the things others overlook. Your discretion is, frankly, invaluable. The Wisterfields prefer to keep their dignity intact, you'll understand. They fear scandal more than any talk of curses. She considered the furnishings, the hush of old wood, the faint rustle of unseen pages in the next room. It struck her that Mr. Pendleton's tidy aura contrasted sharply with the murkiness of what he was asking, yet she also recognized that resolute set of his brow. He wasn't one for flights of fancy. If he believed these diaries indicated foul play, it likely meant something tangible lurked beneath the rumour mill. "Have you told the family of your intentions?" she asked gently. He gave a small, dry smile. "So you know, some suspect, but not all. Let's call it a private arrangement between Sir Percival and myself. Officially, you're just going to stay as a guest, show some interest in the estate's history. Unofficially, we hope you'll root out the truth." Miss Marple slipped off her gloves and placed them tidily in her handbag, a subtle ritual she performed when accepting a task with serious intent. "It sounds a formidable challenge, Mr. Pendleton." Her tone was mild, but there was a steadfast light in her eyes. "I'm quite intrigued." He exhaled, relief softening the lines in his face. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice even more. "It's not merely an academic exercise. A suspicious death from the 1920s might have ties to more recent tragedies, all glibly explained away by the Wisterfield curse. If there's a murderer, and I do use that word carefully, I fear they've operated unimpeded for some time." She allowed a small silence to settle, digesting the gravity of his words. "I'll do my utmost," she said at last. "To examine all angles. Sometimes superstition is more convenient than the truth, and far less terrifying in the end." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "You have no idea how grateful we are. I shall arrange everything. You'll arrive at Wisterfield Hall on Friday, ostensibly to catalogue old letters, at Sir Percival's request." She found the notion quietly amusing. Miss Marple, a mild spinster from St. Mary Mead, suddenly pressed into detective service on a grand estate. Yet she said nothing about her amusement, only returned his smile with a composed nod. They rose, the meeting nearly concluded. Mr. Pendleton escorted her to the door, hand resting lightly on her elbow as though guiding her from potential prying eyes. Along the corridor, employees maintained their respectful hush, heads bent over typewriters and ledgers. Before she left, she hesitated, a final question simmering in her mind. "If I may, what exactly do those diaries contain beyond that snippet?" He frowned. "Mostly cryptic references to accidents that weren't accidents, to money or property concerns, always followed by the writer's sense of dread. I'm no detective, but I can read between the lines, Miss Marple. This family has a skeleton or two rattling around its closets." Outside, the day had warmed, bringing a faint haze to the town's rooftops. A distant church bell struck the hour. Miss Marple paused on the step, drawing in a measured breath. In her bag lay the solicitor's scribbled directions to Wisterfield Hall, along with a carefully typed letter of introduction. She knew the path ahead would be lined with half-truths and polite misdirection, especially in a society where preserving a grand family's reputation often overshadowed justice. But she also knew the surest means of shining a light on old secrets was to wear the same benign smile that fooled so many. If someone was orchestrating these accidents, they might never suspect a quiet lady with a knack for noticing small inconsistencies. Her thoughts were punctuated by a carriage rattling down the cobblestones, the driver calling out a half-hearted greeting. Miss Marple offered a courteous nod. Then, with that calm, methodical grace so characteristic of her, she set her course back to the railway station. A place called Wisterfield Hall awaited, its brambles of rumour entwined in diaries and curses, and quite possibly murder. The next step of her journey would be made in silence and observation, and there was no one better equipped for it. After all, curses were only as powerful as people's willingness to believe them. And if there was something more tangible, like old-fashioned greed or the cunning hand of a killer, well, that was a truth even a dusty diary could reveal to those who knew how to read between the lines. The road snaked through a grove of twisted elm trees before opening onto a broad gravel drive. Dust swirled in the evening light as the taxi's wheels crunched to a halt. Miss Marple stepped down with careful grace, her eyes taking in the imposing silhouette of Wisterfield Hall. It loomed against the dusky sky like a grand dowager whose youth and beauty had long since passed. Echoes of past grandeur hidden beneath creeping ivy and chipped stone. From her vantage at the bottom of the entrance steps, Miss Marple caught the scent of damp leaves and neglected roses. A breeze stirred the overgrown hedges, carrying a whisper of something long buried. Scandal, or secrets best left alone. Adjusting her hat, she made her way up the worn marble stairs, bag in hand. The heavy double doors, carved with ancestral crests, swung inward on whining hinges. Inside, the foyer spread out like a dark cathedral. Chandeliers of crystal and brass gleamed faintly, though many bulbs had burned out or been left unlit. Dim lamplight underscored the lines of age, a threadbare carpet, streaks of tarnish on gilt frames, smudges at the edges of wallpaper once brilliant with colour. There was opulence here, but it lay beneath layers of quiet neglect. Sir Percival Wisterfield, tall, a touch stocky, strode forward to greet her with rigid courtesy. His salt-and-pepper hair receded from his brow, casting deeper shadows upon anxious grey eyes. "Miss Marple, is it? Delighted you've arrived safely." His tone exuded forced warmth, as if he'd rehearsed the line. I trust the journey wasn't too tiresome." The detective offered a polite smile. "Not at all, Sir Percival. A most scenic route, I should think." Her voice held a gentle calm that often put people at ease, though whether Sir Percival found comfort or merely a polite barrier one could not say. Behind him stood an elderly woman with a rail-thin frame and a face carved by both time and worry. Lady Constance Wisterfield's sharp gaze flickered over Miss Marple before slipping away, as though glancing for ghosts in the flickering candlelight. She wore a high-collared gown of dark velvet, a silver cane at her side. In the half-gloom her eyes glinted with something akin to suspicion. Or perhaps just memory. "Welcome," Lady Constance said. Voice seldom have visitors these days. She paused, her hand trembling on the cane's handle. "And never at night." There was no mistaking her meaning. After dusk, Wisterfield Hall was hardly welcoming. Miss Marple, undeterred, simply dipped her head in a respectful nod. She glimpsed movement in the background, the staff perhaps trying not to stare, or maybe they were. In grand houses such as this, news travelled faster than the speed of telegrams. A single new guest could set an entire household aquiver with speculation. A purposeful click of heels announced the arrival of Mrs. Davenport, the housekeeper. She was a tall woman with hair swept into a strict bun and a no-nonsense manner that bristled at the edges of civility. "I'll show you to your room," she announced firmly. "Unless Sir Percival wishes to speak with you further, ma'am," she added a belated courtesy, as if she only remembered protocol after it had slipped her mind. Sir Percival, still grappling with some inner worry, waved her on. "By all means, Mrs. Davenport. Let Miss Marple freshen up. Supper's at 8. We'll talk then, if you'd prefer." With a final glance, Lady Constance offered Miss Marple the ghost of a polite smile. "Do mind the corridors. Some of them don't have much light. It's easy to lose your way." The soft quaver in her voice suggested more than mere architectural inconvenience. Mrs. Davenport led Miss Marple along a corridor lined with portraits of stiff-lipped ancestors, each in a formal stance, eyes seeming to follow passers-by. Dated brass sconces threw elongated shadows, giving the impression that the entire lineage was leaning in, hungry for gossip. Miss Marple's footsteps fell quietly on the moth-eaten carpet, her calm demeanour unchanged, but her gaze sweeping from faded frames to the intricately moulded crownwork on the ceiling. "Begging your pardon," Mrs. Davenport said, a note of professional distance in her voice, "but we don't often take new guests. The staff are on edge, especially with recent matters." She did not elaborate, but the brief catch in her throat told Miss Marple all she needed to know. Talk of curses and misfortunes still lingered like a bad smell in these halls. They passed a tall window glazed with dust. Beyond the glass, the twilight revealed sprawling gardens gone wild. Thorny rose bushes choked stone statues, and an unkempt hedge maze loomed in silhouette. It felt like another world, one silent with expectation, awaiting some unspoken reckoning. Mrs. Davenport gestured to a door near the end of the corridor. "Your room, ma'am." Inside waited a modest yet comfortable chamber, a canopied bed, and a small writing desk piled with linen stationery bearing the Wisterfield crest. The single lamp on the bedside table glowed faintly, its warm circle of light barely pushing back the gloom. "I trust you'll find everything satisfactory." The housekeeper's voice remained stiff, but her guarded eyes betrayed a cautious curiosity. "If you need anything, ring the bell. I'll come or send Mary." "Thank you," Miss Marple replied, setting her handbag on a nearby armchair. "Quite adequate indeed." She paused, letting her eyes drift around the details. The faint whiff of lavender sachets in the drawers, a tapestry depicting huntsmen and hounds chasing a stag. No doubt a relic of the family's more prosperous days. "Lovely old tapestry," she remarked lightly. "I imagine it's been in the house for centuries." Mrs. Davenport gave a perfunctory nod. "The family keeps many heirlooms." Her gaze darted to a locked door at the end of the corridor as she turned to leave. "Some rooms are off-limits, of course. Too damaged to be of any use." And with that cryptic explanation, she disappeared down the hallway. Alone, Miss Marple permitted herself a moment's reflection. She removed her hat, smoothed her hair, and listened, truly listened to the house. The hush between the walls felt alive, crackling with the faint hush of secrets. Floorboards creaked in distant rooms. A muffled thump echoed, then faded. She half smiled. Curses and curses indeed. Curiosity pricked at her mind, as if the old tapestry or the locked doors might whisper answers, but she maintained composure. In a house like Wisterfield, illusions were as thick as dust, best to keep her eyes open and her assumptions guarded. A soft rap sounded at the door. She opened it to see a young maid holding a jug of hot water. The maid's wide brown eyes flicked about nervously. "If you please, ma'am, Sir Percival says dinner is in an hour. He wants you to feel welcomed." Her voice trembled, as though she spoke lines in a play and wasn't sure she got the part right. Miss Marple, heartening the girl with a kindly nod, accepted the water. "Thank you, my dear." She waited until the maid withdrew, scurrying off like a mouse in a cathedral. A creeping suspicion told her that everyone here felt like a player in some elaborate stage performance, each with secrets, each anxious that the next act might reveal more than they were prepared to show. She turned back to the tapestry. Light from the bedside lamp caught on a glint of thread, illuminating a hound's embroidered teeth. What she recalled Mr. Pendleton's words about diaries, hinting at something beyond mere superstition. And so, in the dim hush of Wisterfield Hall, Miss Marple readied herself for whatever shadowy steps lay ahead. This place was no mere relic of the past, it was a living testament to secrets lost in dark corners. Sooner or later one of those secrets would speak up, if only to defend itself. Outside, dusk settled into full night. The lingering glow through the tall windows became no more than a faint glimmer on tangled gardens and creeping ivy. Within the manor's ageing corridors, echoes of half-forgotten regrets seemed to linger at the edge of every footstep. Miss Marple took a moment to straighten her jacket, smoothing imaginary wrinkles. She would be heading downstairs soon, ready to meet the rest of the household at dinner, ready to observe, to listen, and to catch the subtle clues that had a habit of surfacing in quiet conversation. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed the hour, its deep knell resonating through the walls. In the hush that followed, Miss Marple sensed the quiet tension that shrouded Wisterfield like a worn velvet cloak. The stage was set, and though the players might cling to old illusions, the time for truth would come. With that she flicked off the bedside lamp, letting the darkness settle in. There was no rush. The night was still young, and a labyrinth of secrets lay waiting to be discovered. If there was a killer lurking under the guise of a curse, Miss Marple intended to meet them armed with nothing more and nothing less than her relentless curiosity and unassuming charm. A long gilded mirror loomed over the drawing-room fireplace, reflecting the subtle tensions in the room as though capturing ghosts. Electric lamps fizzed against velvet wallpaper, revealing corners of the stately space that time had draped in shadows. Beneath a high ceiling where cobwebs lurked in the filigree, members of the Wisterfield clan assembled at Sir Percival's summons, each perched in cautious clusters. The air carried a cool hush, as though the very walls listened in. Miss Marple stood near a polished sideboard, sampling a small glass of cordial with quiet interest. Though she appeared the picture of genteel reserve, hands folded, posture upright, her gaze swept the room like a watchman's lantern. She noticed a hint of rancour in the set of a distant cousin's jaw, the tremor in Lady Constance's fingers as she clutched her cane by the settee, the anxious glances two siblings exchanged from opposite ends of the room as if fearful of unseen ears. Everyone here had something to conceal, or so it seemed. Sir Percival, shifting his stance with restless energy, cleared his throat to garner attention. "Thank you all for gathering. I realize it's somewhat unusual to call a family discussion at this hour." His eyes darted to a tall clock, ticking away against the panelled walls. "But matters pressing on us can't be ignored forever." He attempted a confident smile, but it emerged shaky at the corners, as though poorly pinned. A hush stretched across the drawing-room, interrupted only by the shuffle of feet on the Persian rug. Someone coughed. Someone else fiddled with a teacup. Lady Constance, perched stiffly on a settee nearest the library doors, said nothing. Under the chandelier's glow her pale complexion verged on translucent, revealing the deep lines of worry etched around her mouth. Miss Marple watched the subtle interplay of apprehension and curiosity among the guests. Distant cousins, two men in well-tailored suits, a woman with a flamboyant cloche hat, lingered together with forced smiles that never quite reached their eyes. A brother and sister, rumoured to be quarrelling over an inheritance, hovered near the door. Small talk had sputtered out minutes ago. Mention of the so-called murder from decades past caused an abrupt shift of posture, as though each set of shoulders carried the weight of that old spectre. The hush that followed Sir Percival's words reminded Miss Marple of a child stepping onto thin ice, uncertain which footfall might crack the surface. She took another small sip of cordial, letting the tension churn. In her mind's eye she noted the swirling currents of suspicion, glances that flicked from one face to another, searching for a chink in the facade. Clearing his throat again, Sir Percival ventured on, "It's no secret that our dear estate has accrued certain superstitions over the centuries. We all know the stories of a curse, that in every generation a Wisterfield meets a tragic, often unexplained end. My father dismissed it as nonsense, but the rumours persist." He gave a wan smile, half apologetic. "In truth, these stories cast a long shadow on our family, and recently, with new details emerging about the 1920s tragedy, I thought it best we address matters plainly. Miss Marple here," he gestured, voice wobbling just a little, "has joined us to help set things to rest." At her cue, Miss Marple bowed her head slightly, eyes still mild as a Sunday school teacher's. A ripple of discomfort moved through the gathering. One cousin, tall and severe, pressed parted lips together, as though suppressing a question. Another relative, an elegant woman wearing too many pearls, shot a furtive glance at Lady Constance, who remained silent but watchful. Lady Constance at length set her cane aside and spoke in a voice low yet resonant. "You must forgive our wariness, Miss Marple. The stories you hear, the speculation, some prefer them, remain just that, speculation." Her face twitched in a ghost of a smile. "Our family has had enough tragedy without sensational rumours, but if you seek clarity, well, perhaps it's time." A hush fell again, thick as the musty drapes that lined the walls. The distant cousins shifted, rearranging themselves in an uncertain dance of decorum. Miss Marple sensed the moment had turned confessional, the entire room poised on the edge of old pain, secret shame, and abiding mistrust. Breaking the tension, a slender man with a quick wit, introduced earlier as Cousin Lionel, let out a soft chuckle that rang false. "Come now, a family curse?" He glanced around with feigned confidence. "Surely we're above such superstition in this enlightened age?" No one laughed in reply. Instead, another cousin, half hidden behind the high-backed sofa, spoke in a near whisper. "Yet tragedy does follow us, does it not? Uncle Edward, Harriet. The list grows." She left the names hanging like a damp cloth on a line, an air of finality in each syllable. Sir Percival fidgeted with the lapel of his jacket. "Which is precisely why we must address it now. If there is, in fact, a pattern—" He paused, swallowing something akin to dread. "Then we owe it to ourselves to see if that pattern has, shall we say, a more earthly explanation." His words met with stiff nods from some, wary suspicion from others. Miss Marple, on her part, made no grand pronouncements. She merely observed the shifting allegiances and coded glances. Behind each polite mask she glimpsed fear or anger or resentment. Everyone seemed to suspect they knew the culprit behind these dark events, if indeed such a culprit existed. But no one dared speak it aloud. A sudden stirring near the adjoining library drew attention. The door stood ajar, revealing tall bookshelves crammed with leather-bound volumes. Flickers of lamplight danced across the parquet floor within. One of the cousins coughed nervously, as if recalling that the library held a more direct association with tragedy. "Whispers of a body found in that very room, locked from the inside." A hush settled once again. Sir Percival exhaled, stepping toward the threshold that connected drawing-room to library. "I shall do my utmost to quell these rumours," he declared. "But if the diaries and old letters prove anything, well, the truth may be more disturbing than a mere curse." From her vantage, Miss Marple watched the guests. She saw how Cousin Lionel's forced bravado seemed to falter, the severe cousin's mouth pressed into a tight line. Lady Constance's frail figure appeared to wilt further against the settee, her eyes gliding from face to face as if searching for something. perhaps betrayal or confirmation. A mild exchange of niceties followed, talk of supper or a nightcap, but no one seemed especially hungry. Each relative had their own reason to steer the conversation away from the family's skeletons. Miss Marple's voice, when it finally came, was soft as a leaf falling in autumn. "I appreciate your candidness, Sir Percival," she said. "Sometimes merely shedding light on what lurks in the dark is enough to loosen its hold." Her comment drew a faint smirk from Lady Constance. "If only," the old matriarch murmured, "the Wisterfields have lived under shadows for generations. It remains to be seen what more light might reveal." A faint ring from the hallway signalled the dinner bell, yet no one rushed to respond. Instead, they lingered, uneasy, in that plush drawing-room. The chandelier overhead rattled a little, as though responding to the unspoken tension. Then, one by one, the relatives drifted into the corridor, leaving Miss Marple and Sir Percival trailing behind. She took a final glance around the drawing-room, the tall mirror reflecting the receding figures, the aura of half-truths clinging to every plush seat and ornate painting. The hush felt like a held breath, waiting for a secret to be spoken. When they were alone, Sir Percival lowered his voice. "I'm grateful for your calm, Miss Marple. Truly. My family, they are not accustomed to direct questions." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "In my experience, Sir Percival, everyone has answers. They just don't always know the questions yet." They left the drawing-room, stepping through the threshold as a draught fluttered the curtains. And in that moment, as the chandelier's glow yielded to the corridor's shadows, Miss Marple suspected that Wisterfield Hall's secrets were deeper than mere superstition. Fear, jealousy, and greed thrived behind its closed doors. The puzzle lay in fitting each piece of the Wisterfield puzzle into place before another tragedy, curse or not, paid the family an irrevocable visit. Twilight wrapped the drawing-room in wavering shadows, softened only by the glow of a pair of tall lamps. Their light glanced off polished wood panelling, reflecting faintly in the mirrors that lined the walls like silent spectators. Miss Marple stood near the velvet drapes, letting her eyes rove over the assembled Wisterfields. Voices mingled, tense, subdued, and laced with a practised politeness that suggested more than courtesy was at stake. Sir Percival Wisterfield was seated at the head of a long, gleaming table. Unlike the usual grand feasts hosted in this hall, this was a smaller, more intimate affair, if it could be called that. He tapped his fingertips on the tabletop, as if he hoped his own impatience might set the tone. Several relatives ringed him, distant cousins, a sibling or two, Lady Constance just behind his right shoulder. Murmurs rolled across the room, but no one ventured a direct question. "Thank you all for coming," Sir Percival began. His voice quivered with an eagerness to quell unrest, to contain gossip. But he tried to sound commanding. "These informal gatherings aren't typical, but given the circumstances, I felt it necessary." A thin cousin in a threadbare suit cleared his throat. Circumstances indeed. Folks are whispering again, and frankly it's getting out of hand." His eyes darted across faces, as though gauging who believed what. A cousin with a formidable jaw and an air of offended pride spoke next, voice brimming with condemnation. "What I want to know," he said sharply, "is why an outsider has been brought in. No offence," a stiff nod toward Miss Marple, "but I can't see how exposing our private matters to a stranger is going to do any good." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile, the kind that revealed nothing except her impeccable manners. "I assure you, dear sir, I've no intention of intruding on anything unnecessarily private. But some matters benefit from fresh eyes." He snorted, arms folded. "That's all well and good, but we've had enough rumours in this house, enough prying eyes for a lifetime." Before Sir Percival could chastise him, another voice piped in, a nervous, breathy cousin, her posture half hidden behind a high-backed chair. "I've heard noises," she said, her cheeks reddening at the attention. "At night, in the corridors. Footsteps when no one's there. If you ask me, this place is haunted. And if there is a curse—" She shuddered. "Well, I wouldn't doubt it." A ripple of hushed discomfort passed through the gathering. Lady Constance raised a slender hand to quiet the stir. "Superstitious nonsense," she murmured, though her tone wavered on the last word. She glanced at Miss Marple, the faintest hint of apology in her eyes. Sir Percival seized the moment. "Precisely why we must dispel these rumours once and for all. The Wisterfield name has suffered enough from idle talk and old tragedies. If we can prove the curse is but a myth—" He paused, glancing almost helplessly at Miss Marple. "That's where our good friend here can assist." Miss Marple caught how quickly he'd pivoted from politely cordial to putting her on the spot. She returned his look with calm assurance. "I intend only to understand how so many accidents," she let the word hang delicately, "could befall a single household. Perhaps it's chance, perhaps something else. The important thing is to look at the facts." The defensive cousin tried another objection, but Sir Percival waved him down. The hush that followed was almost suffocating, a moment suspended between fear and resentment. At length Sir Percival dismissed them with practised graciousness. "Thank you all for humouring my request. I won't take more of your time tonight." Little knots of family members drifted toward the door, subdued as funeral-goers. Lady Constance, however, remained by the tall windows, staring out at the mist-clad gardens. She beckoned Miss Marple closer with a subtle tilt of her head. When the others had vanished into the corridors, she turned, pressing a thin hand to the cameo at her throat. "I'm sorry about all that unpleasantness. We're not unaccustomed to conflict here, but it's wearing all the same." Miss Marple noted the tremor in the older woman's voice. "Tensions run high when tragedy lingers unchecked," she said gently. "I suspect most families would react similarly." Lady Constance's gaze roved around the drawing-room, resting momentarily on the doors to the adjacent library. Motes of dust drifted in the lamplight, as though time itself had slowed. "I've never truly believed in curses. But how else do we explain all those untimely deaths?" Her voice came out in a whisper, full of old heartbreak and a flicker of shame at acknowledging something so superstitious. For a moment, the older woman looked frailer than ever, decades of sorrow etched into her features, and Miss Marple could see that stoic composure cracking just a little at the edges. "I tried telling myself it's coincidence, or God's will, if you like. Then I look around and see the hush that falls whenever someone mentions the library, or the black armband a maid discreetly wore after the last tragedy, and I realize how fear has rooted itself in these very walls." Gentle but resolute, Miss Marple laid a hand on Lady Constance's wrist. "From what I've seen, fear can flourish on illusions. If there is something more grounded at work here, something that's been conveniently labelled curse, light might be the best remedy." Lady Constance let out a slow sigh, her cane tapping softly on the marbled floor. "Perhaps. I only hope the truth is less frightening than the rumours." Miss Marple's smile held no judgment, merely understanding. "That's all truth tends to be. Frightening at first, but undeniably simpler than living under a cloud of speculation." The next chime of a distant clock reminded them of the hour. Voices rose faintly in the corridor, family members whispering behind closed doors or scuttling off to separate corners. Miss Marple excused herself, leaving Lady Constance near the window, gazing at her own ghostly reflection in the glass. Outside, the world was cloaked in twilight. The hush inside the hall carried a stillness suggesting that any word or misstep could awaken old grudges. Yet, in that hush, Miss Marple felt a spark. Doubt had been sown, and with doubt came the possibility of reason emerging from beneath the veil of superstition. She moved quietly toward the corridor, the resonance of her footsteps swallowed by thick carpets. With each stride she held on to the notion that curses seldom stood up to scrutiny. Sooner or later the shadowy corners of Wisterfield Hall would yield a secret or two, and if not to her gentle queries, then perhaps to the weight of its own hidden guilt. In a wing of Wisterfield Hall seldom trodden by living feet, the air was thick with dust, and the ghosts of neglect. Miss Marple, her eyes alight with quiet determination, followed an estate archivist down a narrow, creaking staircase into the attic. Here the splendour of bygone days was eclipsed by cobweb trunks, battered crates, and a pervasive must of old paper. The space, small and claustrophobic, seemed to harbour more secrets than the stately drawing-room had ever revealed. "Mind your step, Miss Marple," the archivist, an unassuming gentleman named Mr. Blackwood, warned in a hushed tone as he carefully lifted the lid of a large, cracked wooden chest. "These relics aren't just memories. They're prone to upset." His voice carried a measured timbre that belied the urgency of the moment. Miss Marple smiled in gentle acknowledgment. "I dare say, Mr. Blackwood, even memories can be dangerous when left unchecked." Her dry wit, though subtle, lent an air of both humour and resolve to her measured steps. Together they combed through piles of faded letters, yellowed photographs, and battered diaries that whispered of a once vibrant family legacy, now marred by sorrow and secrecy. They paused before a particularly worn trunk, its surface etched with the delicate patterns of a long-forgotten era. As Mr. Blackwood propped it open, Miss Marple's gaze fell upon a small, leather-bound volume with pages scorched at the edges. A diary, half-burned and brittle with age. Its cover bore an embossed crest and initials that hinted at a Victorian matriarch, her name lost to time, but her words indelibly inked upon the fragile pages. "Now this is intriguing," she murmured, delicately lifting the diary from the trunk as if it were a sacred relic. The faded ink on the page declared in an almost ghostly hand, "Dark deeds done in the family's name." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the clue resonating with the undercurrent of tragedy and hidden malice that had plagued Wisterfields for generations. Just then footsteps echoed in the narrow corridor outside the attic. Sir Percival appeared at the doorway for a brief moment, his face a mixture of apprehension and relief. "Miss Marple," he said softly, "I'm grateful you're delving into these archives. There are matters here I'd rather not see brought to light, but perhaps truth is a force too potent to suppress." Before she could reply, Mr. Pendleton, the family solicitor, stepped in behind him, his tone low and measured. "Indeed," he added. "It seems that even the ashes of history have something to tell. I trust you'll find this diary as illuminating as it is unsettling." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression inscrutable. "History, like a good mystery, leaves behind breadcrumbs," she observed. "Sometimes even the charred remnants of a diary can speak volumes if one listens carefully." Her voice carried the calm authority of a woman accustomed to deciphering human nature, and behind her mild smile lay the sharpness of a mind that missed nothing. Returning her focus to the fragile pages, she carefully turned them, the script of the Victorian matriarch narrating not just the weight of personal regrets, but hints of conspiracy. A string of events and tragedies that might not have been as coincidental as the family's lamentable lore would suggest. The diary's cryptic passages spoke of clandestine meetings, financial woes that bordered on extortion, and whispered warnings of retribution that smacked more of calculated malice than of supernatural fate. "Quite the portfolio of misfortune," Miss Marple remarked dryly, glancing at Mr. Blackwood. "It appears that our dear matriarch was as adept at concealing truths as any modern spin-doctor." Mr. Blackwood, shifting uncomfortably among the dusty boxes, offered a tentative smile. "I've always believed that the past holds its secrets close, Miss Marple. It takes a keen eye to see the patterns beneath the sorrow and the charred ink." As they continued their examination, the attic's oppressive atmosphere, thick with the tangible weight of long-ago despair, seemed to press in on them. Yet within that stifling gloom, the diary's revelations began to stitch together a tapestry of motives, greed lurking behind lavish inheritances, jealousy simmering beneath the polished veneer of aristocracy, and fear that had for generations been masked by talk of curses and superstitions. Miss Marple's mind worked methodically, each line of the diary a subtle clue, a red herring, to be weighed against the cold logic of human nature. "It appears," she whispered almost to herself as she carefully set the diary aside in a protective case, that the true curse here may be nothing more than the sins of men, hidden behind ghost stories and well-practiced deference. Her observation, delivered with the calm precision of a seasoned detective, resonated in the silence of the attic. Outside, the wind began to murmur through the eaves, as if echoing the long-forgotten secrets that now stirred awake under Miss Marple's attentive gaze. And in that charged moment it was clear. The dusty relics of the past were not inert artifacts, but living clues, each one beckoning toward a truth obscured by both time and the artful silence of those determined to hide their misdeeds. In the lesser-used wing of Wisterfield Hall, where the glow of recent grandeur had long since been swallowed by dust and decay, Miss Marple ascended a narrow, creaking staircase into the attic. The space was a cramped archive of forgotten memories. Cobwebbed trunks, battered crates, and the musty tang of old paper mingled with the faint odour of mothballs. Here, amid the relics of the past, even the silence seemed to murmur secrets. An estate archivist, a taciturn man named Mr. Blackwood, assisted her as he hefted a heavy storage box to one side. "I've kept these boxes undisturbed for years," he said quietly, his tone a blend of respect and unease. "The family isn't keen on stirring up what might be best left buried." His words, like the scattered dust motes in the stale air, hinted at mysteries too weighty to ignore. Miss Marple's eyes, ever observant beneath the brim of her modest hat, swept over the chaotic assemblage of letters, photographs, and diaries. Her gloved fingers brushed against a small leather-bound volume, with its cover embossed by a faded crest. The diary, though its pages were brittle and corners singed, bore a chill message in its very title, if one could call it that, a testament to dark deeds committed in the family's name. With methodical care she opened the diary. The hand of a Victorian matriarch, firm yet tremulous with despair, had scrawled across the yellowed pages cryptic entries of misfortune. As Miss Marple turned the fragile leaves, her practised eye caught sight of a folded envelope tucked between them. Its edges were blackened by flame, and it seemed almost to pulse with a silent urgency. Breaking the delicate seal, Miss Marple extracted a letter. In neat, sombre script it read, "Beware the bloodline tainted by one whose very nature feasts upon violence. The illegitimate Wisterfield, our black sheep, carries within him an appetite for murder that can never be sated." A pause fell over the attic. The phrase "appetite for murder" resonated in the stillness, its implications far removed from superstitious mumblings. It was a warning, not from the beyond, but from a hand steeped in familial bitterness and the dark calculus of revenge. At that moment the door creaked, and Sir Percival appeared briefly in the doorway, his expression a complex mask of concern and reluctance. "Miss Marple," he murmured, voice low, "I hoped you'd find something—" Before any further word could pass, Mr. Pendleton entered, his polished manner momentarily at odds with the grim relics around them. "I trust the archives are proving useful," he said, his tone measured and cool, a gentleman accustomed to dancing around inconvenient truths. Miss Marple closed the diary with deliberate care. "This letter," she said, holding it up for both men to see, "points to an illegitimate branch of our dear family, a relative whose violent proclivities might explain more than mere misfortune." Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, flicked to Mr. Pendleton. "It suggests that what has been cloaked as a curse might in fact be a convenient ruse to cover up actual crimes." Mr. Pendleton's lips tightened. "You mean to say that our so-called curse is but a smokescreen?" he asked, his voice betraying a note of apprehension. "Precisely," Miss Marple replied in her characteristically unflappable tone, a dry smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "When tragedy becomes a family trademark, one must wonder if fate has been suborned by a more deliberate hand. Greed, jealousy, and fear, it seems, can be as lethal as any supernatural force." Mr. Blackwood shuffled closer, his eyes flickering over the diary and the letter as if in silent confirmation. "It appears," he said softly, that this relic may tie together the many unexplained deaths, not accidents, but acts, calculated, perhaps, for the sake of inheritance or revenge. In that cramped, dust-laden space, the evidence coalesced into a narrative far more prosaic than the fanciful legends of curses. It was a conspiracy woven from human ambition, a cover-up by those who preferred scandal to the ignominy of admitting their own culpability. Miss Marple's realization was as clear as the faded ink on the fragile pages. The curse, then, is not an act of divine retribution, but the handiwork of men, she murmured, almost to herself, a guise under which the true appetite for murder was masked, generation after generation. Outside the attic's oppressive silence seemed to affirm her deduction. In that moment, as the weight of evidence settled among the dusty boxes and old ledgers, Miss Marple knew that the next step in her investigation would be to peel back the veneer of superstition. The real horrors lay not in spectral curses, but in the cold, calculated deeds of those who had long ruled over Wisterfield with fear and ambition. And with that grim conclusion, the attic, once a repository of forgotten relics, transformed into a vault of undeniable truth. The diary, the cryptic letter, and the whispers of past sins had all converged to reveal that the true curse was not supernatural at all, but human. The late afternoon light slanted through the leaded windows of Wisterfield Hall's grand kitchen, its gleams softened by the lingering patina of decades. Miss Marple, ever the picture of understated inquiry, stepped into the room where Mrs. Davenport, the housekeeper, was busy at the heavy oak counter. The clatter of china and the low murmur of a well-practiced routine lent the space an air of genteel domesticity, a stark contrast to the grim secrets that lurked in every corner of the manor. "Afternoon, Mrs. Davenport," Miss Marple greeted, her tone as warm as the steam rising from the freshly poured tea. Her eyes, sharp beneath a modest hat, flickered with a blend of curiosity and gentle persistence. "I wonder if you might spare a few moments to chat about some of the unfortunate events that have befallen these walls." The housekeeper paused, her calloused hands steadying a porcelain teapot. "Of course, Miss Marple. It's been a hard road for us, what with all the tragedies." "You mean the old murder?" Her voice was low, and though she maintained the dignified reserve of someone accustomed to secrets, her eyes betrayed a note of sorrow. "Yes, precisely that," Miss Marple replied, lifting her cup with measured grace. "I recall the incident of the 1920S in the locked library, where no one ever could quite piece together the manner of the unfortunate demise. There's a peculiar hush that still clings to the memory of that night, isn't there?" Mrs. Davenport's gaze drifted to the heavy wooden door leading to the library. Wakefulness talk that the library was locked from within, as though the victim had met a fate too macabre for plain explanation. Some say it was the curse, others whisper of a family quarrel, masked by superstition. But here we know how fear can thicken the air. Her words were careful, as though weighed against a lifetime of burdened history. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And what of the other tales?" "Rumours of arguments, of old inheritances disputed in hushed tones." Her inquiry was gentle but unyielding, like a soft prod under a veneer of civility. As if summoned by the question, a timid voice from the adjoining staff quarters broke the kitchen's quiet. In a narrow corridor, a young maid, barely past her teens and trembling with apprehension, peeked from behind a slightly ajar door. Her eyes darted about until she was sure no one else could hear. I overheard something last week," she whispered. "There was an argument between two of the family members about the old inheritance, I believe. It sounded fierce, as if one had every right to call the other a thief. They were saying that money was more valuable than a good name or a curse." The maid's confession sent a ripple through the otherwise placid atmosphere. Miss Marple's lips curved into a subtle, knowing smile as she stepped toward the door. "Thank you, dear," she said kindly, though her mind was already piecing together the implications. Greed, it seemed, had long been the invisible hand behind these tragedies. Later, in the shadowed corridor where the kitchen gave way to the servant quarters, Miss Marple paused to speak briefly with the manor's butler, a stately figure with eyes as observant as they were reserved. "Sir," she began softly, "the stories among the staff speak of more than mere superstition. There's talk of arguments over money, and perhaps a motive too practical for curses." The butler's expression remained impassive, though for a brief moment his gaze flickered with a guarded anxiety before he resumed his practised composure. "Madam, we do what we must in a household where pride and profit are entwined. It's best not to disturb what's long been settled in hushed tones." Even the gardener, whose calloused hands had tended to the overgrown grounds for more years than most could remember, contributed his own fragment of recollection while pruning a particularly stubborn rose-bush. "I heard them too," he murmured. "One night." Voices raised as if the very night was alive with anger. The scent of wet earth couldn't mask the bitterness in their words. They argued over fortunes and feuds, of legacies stained by sorrow. His voice was low, yet each word carried the weight of a lifetime amid whispers of discontent. By the time Miss Marple had returned to the drawing-room to review her notes, the methodical collection of confidences and murmurs had painted a picture far removed from the simple ghost stories that had long clung to Wisterfield Hall. Each account, from the whispered admissions of a frightened maid to the measured evasive responses of the butler, hinted at human motives of greed, jealousy, and fear. Motivations that could well explain the unsolved murder of the 1920S without recourse to supernatural forces. As the late afternoon shadows deepened into the early hues of evening, Miss Marple reflected on the subtle clues the day had yielded. In the gentle clink of china, the soft rustle of overgrown corridors, and the quiet yet fervent voices of those who served the household, lay the truth, obscured not by curses, but by the very human imperfections of ambition and resentment. Quietly, she resolved that the next step in her investigation would be to link these seemingly disparate pieces: a locked library, a disputed inheritance, whispered arguments, and reveal the ordinary yet all too demonstrous machinations behind the so-called curse of Wisterfield Hall. Late in the afternoon, when the low sun turned the stone walls of Wisterfield Hall a soft sepia hue, Miss Marple began her methodical round of inquiries. Her gentle persistence had already coaxed small confessions from the manor's staff. Mrs. Davenport's quietly shared memories of locked libraries and hushed quarrels in the corridors, the timid maid's whispered revelations about bitter disputes over old inheritances. Now, with her notepad tucked neatly into her modest handbag, she set her sights on the village, where whispers and weathered clippings might tie together the family's long-held secrets. In the nearby village, a modest building housed the local historical society, a cramped office lined with yellowed newspapers and brittle pamphlets. There Miss Marple met Mr. Hargreaves, an elderly historian with a shock of silver hair and a pair of spectacles that magnified his earnest eyes. He greeted her with a courteous nod as she settled into a threadbare armchair, the scent of old paper and ink filling the room. "Miss Marple, I understand you're looking into the Wisterfield affair," Mr. Hargreaves said, tapping a stack of newspaper clippings on his desk. "These clippings have been gathered over decades. Most attribute the untimely death of the heir in that locked library to nothing more than a dreadful curse." He slid a brittle paper toward her, its headline bold and accusatory. "Here's tragic demise blamed on supernatural curse." Miss Marple examined the clipping with quiet deliberation. "Curse or not," she murmured, her tones soft yet piercing, "it appears that the family fortune benefited from each of these misfortunes." Her eyes flicked up to meet Mr. Hargreaves, and he nodded as though confirming a long-held suspicion. He continued, voice low, "You see, dear lady, the local papers would often sensationalize such tragedies, but beneath the theatrics there were hints, financial windfalls, unexpected changes in wills, that suggest these weren't mere accidents or acts of fate." His fingers brushed over another clipping detailing a similarly mysterious death in an earlier century, the margins filled with scribbled notes like inheritance, settlement, and beneficiary. Leaving the Historical Society with a small bundle of clippings and a mind brimming with implications, Miss Marple returned to the manor to piece together her puzzle. The data she had collected from the staff, quiet murmurs of locked rooms and whispered family feuds, and the vivid if sensational accounts from the village painted a broader picture. The recurrent narrative of a curse was too conveniently timed with deaths that enriched certain branches of the Wisterfield lineage. In the hushed corridors of Wisterfield Hall, she retreated to a secluded alcove off the main staircase and pored over her findings. The brittle pages of newspaper articles, the soft recollections of frightened servants, and the measured words of a local historian began to interlace in her mind. One clipping's headline proclaimed, "Inherited Tragedy, Fortune and Misfortune at Wisterfield." Another contained a quote from a long-departed editor. "When death visits the family, it leaves behind a trail of wealth as well as sorrow." A subtle smile tugged at Miss Marple's lips. "It seems," she observed quietly to herself, "that while superstition may have provided a convenient cloak, the real hand guiding these tragedies is all too human. Greed, jealousy, and fear sculpted into every whispered rumour." Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft murmur of voices from the kitchen, where Mrs. Davenport, the butler, and the gardener had gathered for an early tea. They spoke in low tones of the past, of arguments over sums of money, and of unexplained tensions that had grown into family legends. A servant confided, "I always thought the curse was a tale told to keep us in line, but it's the rich who seem to prosper from every untimely death." Miss Marple listened with the attentive empathy of someone who understood that every word, every glance, was a piece of a larger puzzle. The whispered recollections, the angry undertones in discussions of money and legacy, all pointed to a systematic pattern. The misfortunes that befell the Wisterfields were not the caprice of fate, but rather a cold calculation. By the time twilight draped its quiet shadows over the estate, Miss Marple had built a tentative framework for her investigation. The newspaper clippings and the staff's cautious confessions began to coalesce into a theory. Was nothing more than a cunning facade meticulously maintained to mask crimes of opportunity. Certain members of the family had reaped financial rewards from these tragedies, their hands stained with both money and moral decay. With dry wit and unwavering resolve she mused, "It appears that the true curse is not an otherworldly spectre, but the all-too-familiar vices of greed and jealousy. And in the murmurings of a village and the quiet confessions of servants, we find the truth that no amount of superstition can hide." Thus, in the quiet, methodical manner that had become her trademark, Miss Marple set the stage for the unravelling of a long-held conspiracy, a puzzle that, piece by piece, would reveal that the sinister history of Wisterfield Hall was crafted not by a supernatural force, but by the very human desire for power and wealth. In a modest study, tucked away in a neglected wing of Wisterfield Hall, time itself seemed to slouch in the dusty air. Faded genealogical charts, brittle ledgers, and family trees, some meticulously drawn, others hastily scrawled, clung to the walls like cobwebs of memory. The single green banker's lamp cast a wan glow over the records, rendering the room both opulent and oppressively claustrophobic, as though every secret had found a place to hide in these confined quarters. Miss Marple stood before a large oak desk, her gloved hands resting lightly on a spread of parchments. Lady Constance, dignified despite years that had etched sorrow into her features, entered with a measured step. "Miss Marple," she began softly, "I have long guarded these records. The family's history is, as you might say, a labyrinth of half-truths and omissions." With deliberate care she unrolled a series of genealogical charts. "Here," she whispered, "are the records that have been kept from prying eyes, names, dates, and, notably, several blanks and question marks where truth should reside." Miss Marple's keen eyes swept over the charts. "It appears," she murmured, that certain names are missing entirely, as if excised from the family's narrative. Her tone was gentle, but beneath it lay the calm assurance of one accustomed to reading between the lines. "And pray, Lady Constance, might you explain this curious omission?" Lady Constance hesitated, her gaze drifting to a portrait of a stern matriarch in a gilded frame. "There is talk, quiet of course, of an illegitimate branch, a line that was never fully acknowledged. It was deemed best to omit those records to protect the family name from scandal." Her voice faltered only slightly. "I have always suspected that the branch in question, though shrouded in silence, might bear more than just the stain of impropriety." At that moment the study door creaked open, and a distant cousin, Mr. Fenwick, a man whose gaunt features and furtive eyes betrayed a lifetime of unspoken resentments, stepped inside. "I trust you're discussing old family records," he said dryly, his tone a mix of irritation and guarded pride. "Be careful, Miss Marple. Some branches of our family are best left undisturbed." Miss Marple offered him a mild smile that did not quite reach her observant eyes. "On the contrary, Mr. Fenwick," she replied evenly, "I find that even the silenced branches often speak the loudest truths. The very absence of a name can be as revealing as its presence." Her words, though softly spoken, carried the weight of a calculated inquiry. Mr. Fenwick's gaze flickered briefly over the charts before he folded his arms. "Perhaps you are inclined to stir up old ghosts," he muttered. "The records in question trace back to an illegitimate child whose descendants have, over time, exhibited a most unusual penchant for misfortune." His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "There's a rumour, you see, that someone from that line has an appetite for murder, a taste for blood that has, regrettably, benefited certain heirs in more ways than one." A moment of charged silence passed as Miss Marple regarded him. "It is curious," she said slowly, "that each untimely death in our family seems to coincide with an inexplicable infusion of wealth, as though misfortune were being redirected." Her dry wit was not lost in the dim light of the study. "Superstitions make for excellent cover stories, but I suspect a more human hand is at work, one driven by greed, jealousy, and a fear of exposure." Lady Constance, who had been watching silently, finally spoke in a trembling tone. "I have always believed that fate was too capricious to account for the pattern tragedies that have beset our name. Yet, when I gaze upon these omissions, I cannot help but wonder if there was a deliberate effort to hide a murderous streak, a taste for murder, perhaps, as unseemly as it is inevitable in human nature." Mr. Fenwick bristled, his eyes narrowing. "You imply, then, that the so-called curse is nothing more than a well-crafted ruse, a means to obscure the sins of those who would benefit from a death?" "Precisely," Miss Marple interjected softly. "When fortune favours those who profit from calamity, one must ask if a supernatural curse is needed at all." She paused, her gaze drifting over the faded ink and blank spaces. "These records suggest a pattern, one where the misfortunes conveniently align with shifts in inheritance. It is as though a particular branch of this family, the one born of shame and omission, has long harboured a propensity for, shall we say, eliminating obstacles to wealth." The study seemed to lean in closer, the quiet hum of the ancient clock punctuating the tension. In that room, filled with the ghosts of half-remembered histories and hidden branches, the true nature of the Wisterfield legacy was revealed. It was not a curse born of the supernatural, but a deliberate, if unspoken, conspiracy. A lineage marred by a singular appetite for power and blood. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy as she gathered the charts. "It appears the true murderers may be found not in legends but in the living, in the unacknowledged branches of our family tree. A most human curse indeed." And as the fading light gave way to the encroaching night, the study itself seemed to sigh under the burden of its secrets. A quiet testament to the fact that sometimes The darkest truths are hidden in plain sight, among the forgotten names of a family history deliberately rewritten. In a cramped study off a seldom-trod corridor of Wisterfield Hall, time itself seemed suspended amid the yellow genealogical charts and spidery family trees pinned haphazardly to the walls. The space, with its heavy drapes and a single green banker's lamp, exuded both faded opulence and an oppressive claustrophobia, a fitting setting for secrets long kept and names deliberately erased. Miss Marple stood before a broad oak desk, her gloved fingers lightly brushing over brittle records. She had come here to seek clarity in the tangle of half-truths that defined the Wisterfield legacy. The charts, some meticulously drawn, others hastily annotated with question marks and blank spaces, hinted at an omission that had troubled the family for generations. Lady Constance had earlier alluded to a branch of the family, one born of an illegitimate union, that had been quietly expunged from the official records. Before Miss Marple could study the charts further, the door creaked open. In stepped a man whose presence seemed to rip the delicate atmosphere asunder, a distant cousin, scarcely recognized in polite circles, yet unmistakably bearing the family name. His eyes, dark and nervous beneath a furrowed brow, darted about the study as if expecting hidden eyes to be watching. His voice, when he spoke, was clipped with barely concealed hostility. "Forgive my interruption," he said, his tone laced with an edge of resentment, "but I must protest this meddling in affairs best left undisturbed." His gaze flicked to the documents spread before Miss Marple. "Some truths, once brought into the light, cannot be unlearnt." Miss Marple regarded him with a calm that belied the tension crackling in the air. "On the contrary, Mr. Dunstan, if I may call you so," she said softly, "knowledge is the first step toward justice. The records reveal omissions, Mr. Dunstan. Names are missing where they ought to be. Might you explain that?" The distant cousin's nostrils flared imperceptibly. "There are things in a family's past that are better left forgotten," he snapped, though his voice faltered. He hesitated before adding in a lower tone, almost to himself, "And some fortunes, what might have been mine, are lost if the past is stirred up." That off-hand remark, delivered with a bitter sneer, did not escape Miss Marple's notice. The insinuation hung in the air like a wisp of smoke. "What might have been yours?" she inquired, her tone polite yet pointed. "I trust you are referring to matters of inheritance?" He flushed, the colour rising in his cheeks. "Inheritance, fortune, words that carry weight in our family," he said bitterly. "I suppose you've heard that our branch, the one from that illegitimate line, has never been fully acknowledged. Some say we were disowned, not just for scandal, but for a taste for murder." His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, and his eyes darted about, as if to ward off unseen reproach. "You? If you look closely, you'll see that every untimely death in the Wisterfields has conveniently benefited someone from our very blood, unrecognized by polite society." Miss Marple's lips curved in a thin smile, a subtle blend of dry wit and quiet determination. "It is an intriguing theory," she remarked, "that a so-called curse might be nothing more than a convenient cover for calculated misfortune, a scheme engineered by those with something to gain from tragedy." Her eyes lingered on him, noting every twitch of his jaw and the way his fingers drummed nervously against his coat. "Yet I suspect there is more here than mere rumour. Our records suggest a deliberate excision of a branch that may hold the key to these patterned misfortunes." The tension in the room deepened as Mr. Dunstan's expression shifted from indignation to guarded apprehension. He looked away, then back at the genealogical charts, as if hoping they might offer him a defence. "You think," he began haltingly, "that our family's curse is not supernatural at all, but the handiwork of men, driven by envy, greed, and a need to secure what is rightfully theirs?" Miss Marple inclined her head slowly. "I do," she said, her voice measured and calm. "When every tragedy is shadowed by an inexplicable financial benefit, One must ask if fate itself has been manipulated by human hands. The absence of certain names in these records speaks volumes. It appears that the family has long concealed a branch whose misfortunes conveniently paved the way for its more respectable heirs. Lady Constance, who had been silently watching from a carved settee in the dim light, interjected softly, "We have always maintained that some matters are best left in obscurity, but perhaps now the truth must come to light." Her eyes, tired yet resolute, met those of Miss Marple. "I regret that the names of our less favoured kin were expunged, but if such omissions have, over time, masked a pattern of deliberate misdeeds, well, one must consider that even the cursed may be the victims of their own ambition." Mr. Dunstan's hostility cooled into a pained resignation as he mulled over her words. "What would you have me say?" he asked bitterly. "That the so-called curse is nothing more than a ruse, a means to hide a series of calculated murders, all committed to secure the family fortune?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her voice soft but laden with certainty. "I believe that is precisely what the evidence suggests. Greed and jealousy can drive a man to heinous acts, and the fear of scandal is a powerful motivator to rewrite history." Her eyes flicked back to the charts, noting the gaps like silent indictments. "In a family such as this, every untimely death is an opportunity, a tragic chance to rearrange the balance of wealth and power." A long silence fell over the study as the distant cousin wrestled with his own conflicted emotions. Finally he murmured, Perhaps you are right, Miss Marple. Perhaps it is time that the truth, however bitter, be acknowledged." His voice was low, tinged with regret and something else, an unspoken ambition that had driven him into the shadows of his own lineage. As the lamp's feeble light flickered across the scattered records, Miss Marple gathered the charts and records with a quiet resolve. The tangled branches of the family tree, with their deliberate omissions and hidden resentments, now formed a map leading to the heart of the mystery. In that small study, where history was as palpable as the dust in the air, the seeds of suspicion had been sown. Outside, the old walls of Wisterfield Hall seemed to murmur in agreement. The true curse, it now appeared, was not some spectral hex, but the cold, calculated ambition of a man, or a line of men, whose appetite for power had stained the family's legacy. And as Miss Marple stepped out of the study, she carried with her the quiet certainty that every secret has a way of clawing its way into the light, however deeply buried it may be. The library doors had been closed for years, not sealed with hammer and nail, not boarded up like the set of a ghost story, but closed in the way things are when a family would rather forget than remember. The Wisterfields had no use for this room any more. Dust and time had done the job of a padlock. Now, as Miss Marple stood at the threshold, the heavy oak doors groaned against their hinges, the sound breaking the uneasy silence of the manor's west wing. The air inside smelled of aged parchment and something deeper. Stale, dry, as if the room had been holding its breath for decades. Sir Percival stood behind her, arms crossed over his chest, jaw tight. "I see no real purpose in dredging this up," he muttered. Miss Marple, mild as ever, tilted her head. "Closure often arrives in the form of clarity, Sir Percival, and clarity can be most illuminating." The estate caretaker, a stoop-shouldered man named Mr. Yates, had been the one to turn the key. He did so grudgingly, his fingers lingering too long in the lock, as if hoping for some divine intervention to stop him. His sun-creased face was impassive, but his posture betrayed him. He didn't like standing in this room, didn't like the way its silence pressed against him. "You'll pardon me if I don't linger, ma'am," he said, voice rough as gravel. "Never liked this place much." Miss Marple stepped inside, her sharp blue eyes sweeping the room with an ease that suggested she was not looking at it for the first time, but rather seeing it anew. The Wisterfield library was a grand, high-ceilinged room, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and portraits of severe-looking ancestors who had, presumably, done very little reading. A grand fireplace yawned at the far end, its brass fixtures dulled by neglect, A desk heavy with dust sat at the centre of the room like an abandoned stage. It was there, 50 years ago, that Theodore Wisterfield had died. A well-dressed corpse slumped over his desk, an unfinished glass of brandy beside him, a single locked door keeping the mystery intact. "A tragic business," Sir Percival muttered, his gaze distant. Miss Marple did not reply. Instead, she crossed to the desk, her small gloved hand tracing the edge where candle wax had once dripped, hardened, and been forgotten. "The official story," she murmured, "was that Theodore Wisterfield was found here, alone, the doors locked, the windows bolted from the inside. A stroke, they said, an unfortunate accident." She let the words settle. But the whispers told another story. Sir Percival shifted uncomfortably. "The whispers, Miss Marple, are why we have a so-called curse to contend with." "Indeed," she mused, pausing at the nearest window. She pressed the latch, found it stiff with disuse, then turned her attention back to the room's layout. "Tell me, Mr. Yates," she called to the caretaker, who had edged near the door as if proximity alone might invite disaster. "Has anything changed in this room since the tragedy?" Yates exhaled through his nose. "Not a thing, ma'am. No one's had a mind to move so much as a book." "How unusual," she murmured. "What is?" Sir Percival asked. She tapped her fingers against the window-pane. "That an old, once-beloved library remains untouched for 50 years, as though someone wanted it left this way, as though memory itself were best preserved undisturbed." Sir Percival hesitated. "You believe the room was kept intact, not out of grief, but out of necessity?" Miss Marple turned back, studying the desk, the worn carpet beneath it. "I believe, Sir Percival, that some people find comfort in a story well told, that the easiest way to avoid a scandal is to let time do the erasing." She walked the room again, this time slower, more deliberate. "The door? Heavy oak, single lock, no signs of forced entry. The fireplace? Soot-blackened, but otherwise ordinary. The bookshelves? Lined with tomes no one had touched in decades. But it was the desk that held her attention. "There's something missing," she murmured. Sir Percival frowned. "Missing? This room is untouched." She gestured to the desk. "Look here. You see the faint outline where something once sat? The dust settles evenly over time, except where an object shields it." She traced her gloved finger over a faint rectangle. "There was something here, and it's been removed recently." Yates shifted. "A book, maybe." Miss Marple's smile was polite but sharp. "A book, or something that ought to have stayed buried." She stepped back, surveying the room once more. "Let us consider for a moment the night of Theodore Wisterfield's death. He was found slumped over his desk, the doors locked from the inside. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, no forced entry. And yet," she turned to them, eyes bright, "yet the crime was not only committed, but concealed." Sir Percival's voice was low. "You're saying it was murder?" "I'm saying," Miss Marple corrected, "that the circumstances fit murder far better than they do natural causes." Silence stretched, long and uneasy. "Enough," he said at him. "If one wished to stage an accident, how might they go about it? A clever murderer, one with time and patience, might take advantage of a locked room, might poison a drink, perhaps, might stage a scene so convincingly that even the coroner would accept it at face value." Yates, still by the door, exhaled sharply. "You think someone here at the Hall—" Miss Marple gave him a look that silenced the thought before it formed. "I think that the truth, much like dust, has a way of settling in the most inconvenient places, and I believe this room was locked away, not to preserve memory, but to preserve a lie." Sir Percival swallowed hard, his composure cracking ever so slightly. "And if you're right, if it was murder," Miss Marple brushed a speck of dust from her sleeve, "then it stands to reason, Sir Percival, that someone benefited from Theodore Wisterfield's demise. That someone engineered a tale of curses and misfortune to mask a most human crime." Her voice remained steady, but there was something sharp beneath it, a keen awareness that the past was never as dead as one liked to believe. "Tell me," she added, almost lightly, "who stood to gain the most from his death?" Sir Percival hesitated. Miss Marple smiled. She already had her suspicions, and the library had just confirmed them. As they stepped back into the corridor, leaving the room behind them, the heavy doors swung shut with a soft but decisive click. It was not the sound of a room sealing itself in grief. It was the sound of a secret, one that had remained undisturbed for far too long, coming back to life. The library had been left untouched for 50 years, its air thick with the scent of dust, aged parchment, and something less tangible, secrets too stubborn to fade. Miss Marple stepped inside with the unhurried grace of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating rooms filled with unspoken things. The glow from the single-wall sconce barely disturbed the shadows clinging to the corners. The housekeeper had claimed no one set foot in here anymore. That suited Miss Marple just fine. Sir Percival lingered at the threshold, his usual stiff confidence giving way to something closer to unease. He ran a hand over his cravat as though it might steady his nerves. "I don't see what can be gained by raking over old embers, Miss Marple," he said, his voice measured but tight. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Old embers have a way of reigniting under the right conditions, Sir Percival." Mr. Yates, the estate caretaker, grumbled as he stepped past them and dropped a ring of heavy brass keys into his pocket. He had been the one to unlock the doors, though he had not been eager about it. "This room's been shut near half a century. Never liked it much then, don't like it now." Miss Marple surveyed the space, her gaze methodical. The desk, solid and imposing, sat at the centre of the room. The high-backed chair behind it had long since gathered a fine shroud of dust. Bookshelves towered around them, filled with volumes that had not been disturbed in decades. Heavy drapes framed the single large window which overlooked the sprawling grounds. It was here, at this very desk, that Theodore Wisterfield had died, slumped over with an untouched glass of brandy nearby, a locked door behind him, and no signs of intrusion. The official ruling had been a stroke, but the whispers that followed had told a different story. Miss Marple moved with quiet precision, stepping toward the window. She ran her gloved fingers over the glass, her eyes narrowing at a set of faint scratches along the wooden frame. To most it would look like nothing. To her it was a question waiting to be answered. She turned toward Mr. Yates. "You mentioned the room had been shut for years, but tell me, has the window ever been opened?" The caretaker let out a short laugh. "Not a chance. It's bolted, same as the night old Theodore died." Miss Marple pressed lightly against the frame, testing it. Then, with a deft motion, she found what she was looking for, a hidden latch beneath the carved moulding. It gave slightly beneath her touch. "How very interesting," she murmured. Sir Percival frowned. "What are you suggesting?" Miss Marple straightened. "That this locked room may not have been so very locked at all," Sir Percival exhaled sharply. "Are you saying someone staged it?" "I would say," Miss Marple replied lightly, "that someone went to a great deal of trouble to ensure it appeared as though Theodore Wisterfield died alone in this room, with no means of entry or exit." She gestured toward the scratches. "And yet someone was here, someone who ensured they left no obvious trace, except for what time itself has kindly preserved." Mr. Yates shifted uncomfortably. "Ain't my business, but if you're right, that's a nasty bit of work." Miss Marple nodded. "Quite." She turned back to the desk, considering the elements that had shaped the legend. A sudden death, a locked door, a name added to the list of family tragedies that conveniently supported the Wisterfield curse. "Superstition," she said, mostly to herself, "is an excellent deterrent." Sir Percival stared at her. "I beg your pardon?" She tapped her fingers lightly on the desk. "If one wanted to commit a crime and ensure no one looked too closely, what better way than to make it appear as though it were beyond human interference?" She met his gaze. "A locked-room death, whispered about as a curse. It keeps the truth hidden beneath layers of fear and legend." Sir Percival ran a hand over his face. You think someone used the Wisterfield curse as a cover for murder? I think, Miss Marple said, her voice deceptively mild, that whoever killed Theodore Wisterfield did so knowing full well that no one would dare challenge the convenient narrative. A family haunted by misfortune? It's much easier to swallow than the notion that someone, perhaps even someone within these very walls, stood to gain from his death. Silence settled over the room. Sir Percival's expression darkened. "And who exactly do you suspect?" Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, Sir Percival, isn't that the question?" Closing the scene, she turned back to the window, lightly pressing the hidden latch once more. If Theodore Wisterfield's death had been staged, then the murderer had been clever. Exceptionally so, but no crime was perfect, not even one that had been carefully constructed to pass as supernatural. Miss Marple had no doubt now. The past had not been buried by fate or misfortune. It had been buried by someone who had been very much alive at the time, someone who had taken great care to ensure that no one ever looked too deeply. But the thing about buried secrets was that they had a way of surfacing, and Miss Marple had every intention of digging them up. The sitting-room at Wisterfield Hall was not grand like the drawing-room, nor imposing like the library. It was a space meant for quiet conversations, discreet dealings, and, as Miss Marple suspected, a fair number of family secrets. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting long shadows against the velvet drapes. The tension in the room, however, had nothing to do with the flickering light. Miss Marple sat primly in the high-backed chair nearest the fireplace, hands folded neatly in her lap. Before her, an array of expectant and some apprehensive faces watched with varying degrees of composure. Sir Percival stood stiffly near the drinks cabinet, a half-poured brandy forgotten in his hand. Lady Constance sat with her back straight, a delicate porcelain cup resting untouched on the table beside her. Mr. Pendleton, the family solicitor, had positioned himself near the door, as if contemplating the best moment to excuse himself. And then there was Mr. Dunstan, the distant cousin with too many grievances and too few apologies. He leaned against the mantel, jaw tight, fingers drumming against the wood. "I thank you all for gathering," Miss Marple began, her voice as gentle as ever, though the weight in the room suggested something far from polite conversation. "It is never easy to confront the past, but I believe we have reached a moment where we must do just that." Sir Percival exhaled sharply. "Miss Marple, I assume this has something to do with your investigations into my great-uncle's death?" "Quite so," Miss Marple said, her expression mild. "Though, as I have suspected for some time now, his was no mere tragic misfortune, nor was it the work of some supernatural curse, despite what certain legends would have us believe." Lady Constance paled slightly, her hand tightening around the arm of her chair. "Are you suggesting Theodore Wisterfield was murdered?" Miss Marple nodded. "Murdered? Yes, and rather cleverly so. Step-by-step revelation." She glanced at Mr. Pendleton. "It was your mention of the family genealogy that first piqued my interest, Mr. Pendleton. A curious set of omissions in the records, names blotted out or simply left unacknowledged. Why, I wondered, would a family so dedicated to lineage choose to forget certain branches of its own tree?" Mr. Pendleton shifted uncomfortably. "The Wisterfields have always been particular about inheritance," he said cautiously. Miss Marple smiled thinly. "Indeed. And yet, when one follows the money, as I have, it becomes quite clear that some members of the family had much to gain from Theodore Wisterfield's demise." She turned to the group at large. "What do we know of his death? We know he was found slumped over his desk in the library, the door locked, the windows bolted. We know that no one was seen entering or leaving. A mystery that seemed impossible." Her eyes flicked to Sir Percival. "And yet, as we have now discovered, the window had a hidden latch, a very small detail, but one that changes everything." Sir Percival's grip on his glass tightened. "You're saying the murderer escaped through the window?" "I'm saying," Miss Marple replied, "that the scene was staged to appear as though no escape was possible. A locked-room murder is most effective when it appears unsolvable." Lady Constance let out a shaky breath. "But why? Who would go to such lengths?" Miss Marple turned her gaze to Mr. Dunstan. Perhaps someone who was tired of being a forgotten footnote in the family's history, someone who had everything to gain and nothing to lose. Dunstan let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humour in it. "You think I killed him? That's rich." Miss Marple tilted her head. "I think you were the most obvious suspect, which is why I considered it too easy an answer. No, the real culprit was someone far more patient, someone who understood how to use both family legend and human superstition to their advantage." She let the silence stretch before continuing. "The real murderer was someone who needed Theodore Wisterfield out of the way, someone who had access to the library, knowledge of the hidden latch, and, most importantly, someone who understood that the best way to kill without suspicion was to ensure no one dared to ask questions." Her voice softened, but the weight of her words pressed against the room. "The person who killed Theodore Wisterfield was Sir Percival." A hush fell. The only sound was the slow tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway beyond. Sir Percival let out a scoff, but his fingers had gone white around the stem of his glass. "That's preposterous." Miss Marple shook her head. "It's entirely logical. You were the one who stood to inherit the bulk of his estate. Theodore Wisterfield was in the process of altering his will. Mr. Pendleton, I believe you can confirm that." Mr. Pendleton, who had thus far avoided making direct eye contact with anyone, sighed. "Yes," he admitted. "Theodore had mentioned changing the will, though he never signed the final document. Because he was dead before he could do so," Miss Marple said simply. Lady Constance's hand flew to her mouth. "Dear God!" Miss Marple pressed on. "The locked-room illusion was a stroke of genius, really. Theodore trusted you, Sir Percival. He would have accepted a drink from you without suspicion. You poisoned his brandy, then used the window to exit, bolting it behind you from the outside with the hidden latch. The door remained locked, and when he was found, the conclusion was simple: either natural causes or the infamous Wisterfield curse." Sir Percival let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. "And yet here I am, Miss Marple, free, with no evidence against me." Miss Marple gave him a small, knowing smile. "Not quite, Sir Percival. You see, what criminals often forget is that the past doesn't stay buried. When I reopened the library, I found something interesting, a single book missing from the shelves, not valuable, not rare, just out of place, and inside its pages, tucked away for all these years, was a letter written by Theodore Wisterfield on the night of his death." She reached into her handbag and produced a folded, yellowed sheet of paper. "It details his suspicions, his belief that someone was plotting against him, and, most damning of all, it names you." Sir Percival's jaw clenched. "That letter means nothing." Miss Marple's smile remained gentle. "Oh, I suspect a jury would think otherwise." The silence that followed was absolute. Sir Percival set down his glass with slow deliberation. The fire flickered, casting his shadow large against the wall. Mr. Pendleton cleared his throat. "I will of course need to report this to the authorities." Dunstan, for once, said nothing. Lady Constance closed her eyes as if she had been expecting this for years. Miss Marple, ever composed, rose from her chair. "And so, at last, the Wisterfield curse is laid to rest, not by ghosts, nor by fate, but by the truth." As she stepped toward the door, she glanced back once. Sir Percival had not moved, his face unreadable, his fate all but sealed. The truth had come to light, and Wisterfield Hall would never be the same. The private sitting-room at Wisterfield Hall was not a place for drama. It was meant for polite whispers, for tea taken with careful hands, for matters of discretion. But tonight it held something heavier than any of its gilded decor could withstand. The air was thick with it, the kind of tension that settled into the bones when the past finally caught up with the present. Miss Marple sat primly in an armchair near the fireplace, her lace-gloved hands folded in her lap, the very image of calm. Across from her, the Wisterfields assembled, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright dread. Sir Percival stood stiffly by the drinks cabinet, where a brandy sat untouched. Lady Constance, pale but composed, perched on the edge of a chaise longue. Mr. Pendleton, the ever-pragmatic solicitor, leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. And then there was Mr. Dunstan, the black sheep, the distant cousin, the shadow that had always lingered just outside the family's favour. He slouched in a chair, watching Miss Marple with narrowed eyes and something close to amusement. "I thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice pleasant but firm. "It is, of course, an unfortunate business to discuss, but the time has come for the truth to be known." Sir Percival's lip curled. "Must we continue this charade, Miss Marple? My family has endured enough speculation over these so-called tragedies." "Oh, I quite agree," Miss Marple said mildly. "Speculation is tiresome. That is why I am here to replace it with facts." The silence stretched, tense and expectant. Then Miss Marple gestured toward the stack of papers resting on the small side table. "I have here records that have long been forgotten, intentionally so. They detail a branch of the Wisterfield family that was never fully acknowledged." She paused, her keen eyes scanning the room. "I'm an illegitimate line, one that should have faded into obscurity. And yet—" "It did not." Dunstan let out a short laugh, but it had no real humour. "You think I'm the ghost of a forgotten Wisterfield, come to collect what's mine?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, no, Mr. Dunstan. You are very much flesh and blood, and therein lies the problem, doesn't it?" Dunstan's fingers drummed against the arm of his chair. Miss Marple continued, her voice as even as ever. "For generations the Wisterfield family has been plagued by misfortunes. Always a timely death, always an inheritance that shifts in just the right direction, and each time it was blamed on the family curse." Pendleton shifted uncomfortably. "Surely you don't mean to suggest—" "I mean to state quite plainly," Miss Marple interrupted, "that the Wisterfield curse has been nothing more than a most convenient illusion, a story crafted to disguise something far less supernatural." She turned back to Dunstan. "Murder, Mr. Dunstan? A family tradition, one might say?" A murmur rippled through the room. Dunstan sat very still. His face was carefully neutral, but his fingers had stopped drumming. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "You were raised outside Wisterfield, weren't you? Always on the outskirts, always told you weren't quite one of them. That must have been difficult." Dunstan's jaw tightened. Miss Marple's voice softened, but her words were sharp as a knife. "Imagine knowing all your life that you belonged here, that it should have been your name on the family tree, that if only fate had played differently, you would have been the one with a title, a fortune, She let the silence hang, then added, "Or perhaps fate just needed a little encouragement." Dunstan let out a slow breath. "You paint a dramatic picture, Miss Marple." She smiled slightly. "I do believe it is you who has written this particular drama, Mr. Dunstan. Shall I tell you how?" She gestured to the pile of documents. "Theodore Wisterfield's death was no accident. The supposed locked room was a clever ruse, one that only worked because people were so willing to believe in the curse. But we now know that the window had a hidden latch, an exit for a killer who wished to leave no trace." Sir Percival paled slightly. Miss Marple went on. "More recent deaths have followed the same pattern, quiet, unprovable, convenient." Her eyes flicked back to Dunstan. "And all of them benefited the same individual." Dunstan gave her a slow, sardonic smile. "And what exactly are you accusing me of?" Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Carrying on a most unfortunate family tradition." The room was so still that the faint crackle of the fireplace sounded like a gunshot. Dunstan leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "And if I were to admit it?" Lady Constance gasped. Sir Percival took a step forward, face dark with rage. "You!" Dunstan held up a hand. "Don't act so surprised. What do you think this family was built on? Love?" He gave a short, humourless laugh. "For generations Wisterfields have killed each other to get ahead. The only difference is I finally decided it was my turn." Lady Constance's hand trembled against the arm of her chair. "But why?" Dunstan's smile vanished. His voice was quiet. "Because it should have been mine." Miss Marple studied him, her expression unreadable. "And what now, Mr. Dunstan? Do you expect history to absolve you?" Dunstan looked at her for a long moment. Then he exhaled and shook his head. "No," he admitted. "I suppose not." Pendleton cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "We'll notify the authorities." Dunstan's smirk returned, but it was tired. How fitting. The silence stretched as everyone absorbed the weight of what had just been revealed. The Wisterfield curse, unraveled, exposed for what it had always been. Miss Marple rose from her chair, adjusting her gloves. "And so the past catches up with us all. But at least now the Wisterfields can rest without ghosts. Only truth." As she stepped toward the door, she glanced back once at Dunstan. He wasn't smiling anymore. The curse was broken, but the legacy of greed, of ambition, turned to murder, that was something no family tree could ever erase. The makeshift inquest room in the local magistrate's office smelled of old paper and damp wool, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked coats. The room itself was unremarkable. Plain wood-panelled walls, a few stiff-backed chairs, and a long table where a magistrate sat, his expression carved from the same stone as the courthouse steps outside. He listened with patient disinterest as the facts of the Wisterfield case unfolded before him, occasionally making a note in his thick ledger. Dunstan sat opposite, flanked by two uniformed officers, his hands resting too casually on the table. There was no fight left in him, just the remains of a smirk, worn thin like an old playing card. He had played the game and lost. Miss Marple sat quietly, a faint smile touching her lips whenever the magistrate gave her a curious glance. The quiet spinster from St. Mary Mead had managed to do what generations of Wisterfields had failed to: dispel the illusion of the family curse. Sir Percival sat rigid beside Lady Constance, his fingers laced tightly together. His face was drawn, the weight of the revelations having aged him overnight. Beside him, Lady Constance was pale but composed, the same quiet grace she had always carried, now tempered with something more vulnerable. Relief, perhaps, or the hollow realization that the past had not been quite as she'd believed. Pendleton, the ever-recipient solicitor, read from his notes. To summarize, it is clear that the so-called Wisterfield curse was a deliberate fabrication designed to disguise generations of calculated murders. Mr. Dunstan, he cast a sharp glance across the table, used this legend to his advantage, ensuring that his crimes would be attributed to superstition rather than suspicion. Dunstan let out a quiet chuckle. "Can't say it didn't work for a while." The magistrate frowned at him. "You would do well to take these proceedings seriously, sir." Dunstan's smirk faded. He leaned back, expression unreadable. "Oh, I take them very seriously, your worship. Just funny, that's all. How much people will believe if it means they don't have to look too closely." Miss Marple spoke then, her voice light yet firm. "Yes, well, that is the thing about stories, Mr. Dunstan. Sooner or later someone comes along who prefers facts." The magistrate nodded solemnly before turning to the officers. "I believe we are quite done here. Proceed with the necessary charges." Dunstan rose slowly, flexing his fingers as though testing invisible restraints. He turned once towards Sir Percival and Lady Constance. "I suppose this is the part where you claim you never suspected a thing." Sir Percival said nothing. Lady Constance swallowed hard before answering. "I suppose this is the part where you tell us you never cared." Dunstan tilted his head, considering. "Oh, I cared, just not in the way you'd have liked." With that, he was led away, leaving behind nothing but a memory, a bitter echo of the Wisterfield's darkest legacy. The carriage ride back to Wisterfield Hall was silent. The storm that had threatened earlier had finally broken, the rain now falling in steady drizzles against the misted windows. Sir Percival stared out at the bleak countryside, his mind elsewhere. "It's strange," he murmured at last. "All my life I believed in the curse. feared it, let it dictate every decision. His fingers tightened around the edge of his coat. And to think it was nothing more than greed dressed in folklore. Lady Constance, her hands folded in her lap, sighed. It is one thing to believe in fate, Percival, quite another to realize men have been playing at gods. She turned to Miss Marple, offering a weary smile. I don't know how to thank you. Miss Marple patted her gloved hands together. Oh, my dear, no thanks are necessary. One does what one must. Pendleton, sitting opposite, cleared his throat. What happens now, then? The Hall's reputation has been, well, let's say, muddied. Miss Marple gave a wry smile. Oh, I imagine Wisterfield Hall will survive. Grand estates always do, in one way or another. It's people that suffer when secrets fester. Sir Percival let out a heavy breath. I suppose we rebuild, then? Lady Constance turned back toward the window, watching the rain mist over the hills. Or perhaps, she said softly, we simply begin again? A week later, the news had faded. The scandal had been printed, speculated upon, and then promptly replaced by fresher gossip. Wisterfield Hall had become just another legend, the kind that village women whispered about over garden fences. Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead as unceremoniously as she had left, stepping off the train with her single valise, greeted only by the crisp morning air and the familiar sights of home. By the time she reached her cottage, the comforting smell of freshly brewed tea welcomed her. She set her things down, removed her hat, and settled into her favourite chair. Outside, the world continued as it always had. Mrs. Hartley would soon pass by with her Pomeranian, fretting over the price of sugar. The vicar's wife would stop in for tea, eager for any hints of Miss Marple's latest adventure. Yes, life went on, and as Miss Marple sipped her tea, a small smile played at her lips. Wisterfield Hall was free from its ghosts. At least the ones of human design. Another puzzle solved, another story neatly concluded. She reached for her knitting, content to let the world spin on without her, until the next time fate, or folly, sent another mystery her way. The inquest room in the local magistrate's office was as unremarkable as a place of justice could be. Four walls that had heard every kind of lie, a single wooden table scarred with the weight of 100 desperate pleas. Outside, rain tapped against the tall windows, setting a steady rhythm against the murmurs of those assembled. Dunstan sat in the defendant's chair, his hands resting lightly on the tabletop, his expression somewhere between resignation and defiance. The performance was over, and he had played his final act well enough. He watched the proceedings with the air of a man who had already counted his losses. Sir Percival sat beside Lady Constance, his face drawn tight, his posture stiff as if he could will away the weight of history pressing down on him. Lady Constance, for all her poise, seemed suddenly older, as if stripping the legend from the family had taken some of her own substance with it. Pendleton, ever the legal mind, spoke in measured tones as he summarized the evidence. The accused manipulated a long-standing family superstition to cover his actions. The so-called Wisterfield curse, once thought to be an unfortunate legacy, has been nothing more than a convenient disguise for murder. Miss Marple listened with her usual air of quiet certainty, hands folded neatly in her lap. The magistrate, a no-nonsense man with a weary gaze, glanced at her more than once as the truth of the case unfolded. A nod here, a confirming glance there. She did not need to speak. The facts spoke well enough for themselves. Dunstan exhaled slowly, then turned his head towards Sir Percival. "I wonder," he mused, "if you ever suspected the truth? Or did you prefer to believe in curses?" Sir Percival met his gaze without flinching. "I preferred to believe my family wasn't capable of such things." Dunstan let out a dry chuckle. "That was your first mistake," the magistrate sighed, tapping his gavel against the table. "I believe we've heard enough." He turned to the officers. "Proceed with the necessary charges." As the guards moved forward, Dunstan straightened. He looked at Miss Marple, his lips twitching into something that almost resembled admiration. "I suppose I should thank you, Miss Marple," he said. "You saw through the story everyone else was too afraid to question." She regarded him for a long moment, then simply said, "Stories are useful things, Mr. Dunstan, but the truth always outlives them." With that, he was led away. The door closed behind him, sealing the last breath of the Wisterfield curse. The rain had not let up by the time Miss Marple returned to Wisterfield Hall to collect her things. The house loomed against the darkened sky, its ivy-clad walls damp with mist. It was no longer a place of ghosts, only a place where history had been rewritten. The staff had gathered near the entrance. The butler gave her a respectful nod. The housekeeper murmured a soft, "Safe travels, ma'am." Even the gardener, a man who rarely had time for words, tipped his hat. Sir Percival stood beside Lady Constance at the door. "You have done us a great service, Miss Marple," he said quietly, "though I confess I am not certain what comes next." Miss Marple smiled, the kind of smile that carried both kindness and finality. "You live, Sir Percival, without shadows, without ghosts. That is what comes next." Lady Constance pressed her gloved hands together. "I had always thought the past to be immovable," she admitted, "but now it seems—" "Lighter." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It is remarkable what a little clarity can do." With that, she stepped into the waiting carriage. The door shut with a soft click, and the wheels began to roll, carrying her away from the estate, from the whispers of curses and conspiracies, back towards something simpler. As the hall receded into the mist, Miss Marple allowed herself one last glance over her shoulder. The house remained as grand and inscrutable as ever, but for the first time in a long while it no longer looked haunted. The rain had cleared by the time Miss Marple arrived back in St. Mary Mead. The village was much the same, hedgerows neatly trimmed, the scent of baking bread drifting from cottage windows. A few familiar faces waved as she passed. By the time she reached her own doorstep, the sky had softened into a pale blue. She let herself inside, setting her travel bag neatly by the umbrella stand before moving to put the kettle on. Outside, the world continued as it always had. Hartley would soon pass by with her yapping Pomeranian, and the vicar's wife would stop in, eager to press for details about her latest adventure. Miss Marple settled into her chair, picking up her knitting. Curses, she reflected, were nothing more than stories that people told themselves to make sense of the things they did not want to understand. But the truth— she smiled to herself, satisfied. Another puzzle solved, another legend laid to rest. And, as always, there would be more mysteries waiting, but for now there was tea.